All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are working on our next lecture. We are going to focus on urbanization and the methods of urban growth. So for this particular lecture, we are looking at Standard 5B3, which discusses the ways in which humans design systems to provide living space for a growing population. So at the end of this lecture, you should be able to identify conditions that are required to support a human population, compare and contrast methods of urban growth and development, explain the ways in which traditional urban growth affects the environment, identify the ways in which smart growth and eco-cities can allow for urban growth, and explain how population density determines the kinds of resources that are needed in an urban area. So when we talk about urbanization, the first thing we have to do is define urbanization. And this is the process of creating and growing urban and suburban areas. So urbanization has been occurring since humans first settled down to begin farming. And there are several things that urban areas can do to help support a population. First of all, you're looking at those basic things that a population needs to survive. So you need land, you need food, you need water. And an urban area is going to work in some form or fashion to help provide those things. So urbanization is just the creation and growth of an urban area. Urban growth is the rate at which that urban area increases in population or decreases in population. So when we talk about urban growth, we are looking at how it is impacted through people coming in, immigration, people leaving, immigration, and the natural increase or decline due to birth and death rates. There is something that focuses a lot on urban growth that can help to discuss how urban growth is going to happen. And those are what we call push and pull factors. So a push factor is something that encourages an individual to leave an urban area. So things such as pollution, crime, or traffic congestion that is going to make them want to leave. A pull factor is something that is going to encourage an individual to enter an urban area. And these include, for example, better education, better jobs, and better health care. So when we talk about the factors that influence urbanization, we also have to look at what does urbanization look like right now. So currently 52% of the world's population lives in some form of an urban area. And particularly in developing countries, this number is increasing. People are becoming more concentrated. So in a study that was done in 2012, it was estimated that about 48% of the global population lives in only 850 urban areas. And the majority of those have 500,000 people or more each. So that's just about half the population is concentrated in 850 urban areas. When we look at those and we break them down based on their population, we see three kind of levels starting to emerge. So we have what's called a megacity. And a megacity is a city, urban area that has at least 10 million people. Right now, we know of 26 megacities. 19 of those are in lesser developed countries. As of right now, we have 9 hypercities, or an urban area with a population of 20 million or more. And then we have these areas called mega regions that are starting to develop, which have populations of 100 million or more. And as we talked about in the population section, the most rapidly increasing areas are those that are in lesser developed countries. And when we talk about urbanization, we want to talk about it in terms of 3 different waves of urbanization. So the first wave is when you move from the rural area to the urban area. So you move from the country to the city. The second wave of urbanization took place moving from the city center out into the suburbs. And the most recent move in urbanization is people leaving the east and the north to move south and west. So how do we urbanize? When we talk about urbanization, the first thing we have to talk about is infrastructure. We have to have the infrastructure in place in order to be urbanized and to extend our urban areas. So examples of infrastructure include those things that help support and manage the urban area. So we're talking streets, bridges, dams, power lines, schools, sewers, telecommunications, all of those things that support the urban area. If the infrastructure and the transportation methods can expand adequately, then we can develop what's called urban sprawl. And as you see on the left hand or the right hand of your screen, this is an example of suburbs, particularly a planned development. So the availability of large tracts of cheap land in the United States has led to this urban sprawl. And this is large-scale, low-density development. This increases the dependence on cars, and it has massive implications for our agriculture and for our ecosystem biodiversity. We do have this thing called a megapolis, megapolis. A megapolis is an urban area that forms along a transportation corridor where the two areas of urban sprawl merge into a new urban area. There's a very famous one of these that has formed between Washington, D.C. and Boston, Massachusetts. That is termed BOWASH, BOWASH. So this megapolis is when the urban areas and the suburban areas of Washington and Boston have literally merged together over this transportation corridor. So when we talk about urbanization, we have to talk about how are we going to urbanize? How are we going to do that? So right now there are four major models of urban planning and urban development, and they are all kind of determined by their central business district. These four models are the concentric circle model, the multiple nuclei model, the sector city model, and the vertical model. So as you see, far left is the concentric zone model, in which your central business district is right in the middle, and then development occurs in rings around it. The further away from the central business district you get, the more affluent your population. Great example of a concentric zone model city is New York. Then you have the sector city model. In the sector city model, you have the central business district right in the middle, and then you have other areas that have grown out in wedges, typically along transportation corridors. So the city looks a little bit like a pie. One of the best examples of a sector city is Chicago, and there's also parts of London as well that would fall into that. The multiple nuclei model is where you have multiple central business districts and areas that grow up around them with their own zoning. So you may have one large city that's made up of smaller sections that have their own names, and each have their own central business district. A great example of a multiple nuclei model is the Los Angeles area, which is made up of smaller areas with their own CBDs. For example, in Los Angeles, you have Bel Air, Hollywood, Beverly Hills. They're all considered part of Los Angeles, but they have their own central business districts and their own zoning areas. The last thing is the vertical model, which is the newer model that we're using, and it's especially popular in Asian countries, particularly Tokyo, Shanghai, and parts of coastal China. So the vertical model builds up or down rather than spreading out, and makes use of this thing called mixed use zoning. And that's where commercial and residential areas are able to be together. So in some areas of Tokyo, and Tokyo is the best example of a vertical model city. In some of the areas in that city, skyscrapers are actually broken down into three sections. You have commercial areas on the bottom, so shops and restaurants. The middle of the skyscraper is offices, and the very top are residential areas. So what are the impacts of urbanization? So there are a lot of things that happen when we urbanize. So we have increases in air pollution, specifically in terms of exhaust from cars, noise pollution, light pollution. We have an increase in water pollution because we have a lot of impermeable surfaces. When it rains, that water runs off and it carries chemicals such as antifreeze, motor oil, asphalt coverage. It carries all of that into sewer systems, in nearby rivers, and eventually into aquatic ecosystems. We also have loss of biodiversity. Because we are urbanizing, we are spreading out, particularly when we have areas of urban sprawl, we are losing valuable ecosystem land for the purpose of development. We have increased waste production, so we have more solid waste, more liquid waste, more problems with sewers. And lastly, we have changes in what are called microclimates. So this is the area around the urban development. When we talk about a change in microclimate, we're talking about what's called the urban heat island. So an urban heat island is literally the downtown area, the central part of the city, is significantly warmer than the surrounding suburbs and rural areas. And this is because of the things that are used in the city. So we have lots of exhaust from the buses, heating and cooling systems. Because the city is often built with steel and glass and dark paved surfaces, and there's very little vegetation, when sunlight comes in, it tends to be reflected and compounded and kept rather than being released back out into the atmosphere. So this causes the urban area to be much warmer than the surrounding area. So we can urbanize more sustainably by doing several different things. The first thing we can do is exchange low density suburban sprawl for high density vertical growth. So instead of spreading out into single family homes with large tracts of land, build more areas that are high density, that take up less land but can accommodate more people. Plan using smart growth. So smart growth understands that urban growth is going to happen, but you're going to focus more on sustainable development, particularly in leading to less dependence on cars and less urban sprawl. We can implement urban growth boundaries and green belts. So growth boundaries and green belts both set limits on how far urban development can go. Green belts are a physical area of vegetation, typically some kind of forest, that is used to define the boundary of the city. You can engage in new urbanism using cluster development. So if you look at the right of your screen, you see a comparison between cluster housing and more typical housing development. So you're going to move your planning and define your areas of your development of housing, build it around the existing natural area. So they didn't bulldoze the creeks and move them, and they didn't bulldoze the pond, fill it in. They built their housing around those existing natural features. And the last thing you can do is plan an eco-city. So eco-cities are designed to gather energy from renewable resources, such as solar panels on the roof, hot water heaters that are managed by solar energy, geothermal heating, and they reduce the impact of their waste. They reuse or recycle up to 80% of their solid waste. And on top of that, they're going to make use of green roofs or things that they can do to reduce the impact of that urban heat island by getting rid of as much excess heat as possible. All right, go back, make sure that you understand all of these concepts, and let me know if you have questions.